If you were a kid growing up in the 90s, you had no shortage of choice when it came to video game consoles. In the early 90s, the console war had two major players, Sega and Nintendo. Nintendo were the top boys at the turn of the decade, but Sega did do a lot of successful work after the release of the Genesis to win back some of the market share. But as the mid-90s drew closer, gamers wanted one thing and one thing only. Filthy bastards. 3D graphics. And the other big move at the time was moving games to CDs rather than cartridges. While Sega were working on the Saturn, Nintendo had partnered with newcomers to the gaming world, Sony, to bring a CD expansion to the SNES. That was until Nintendo decided to do the most Nintendo thing ever and say, nah, forget about the 3D graphics that the gamers are crying out for, and forget about the move to CDs that the developers are crying out for. We've got our own fucking ideas. Needless to say, Sony weren't best pleased about being picked up and dropped quicker than a criminal charge against Donald Trump, so they decided to take matters into their own hands and create a global phenomenon which would change the face of gaming forever.
I'm talking about this. It may look like a harmless bagel toaster, but inside is a deadly donut.
Of course, eventually Nintendo realised their first foray into 3D gaming was a nausea-inducing fusion of space debris and dog shit, and decided they'd better build something to combat the new bully in the playground. Step forward, the Nintendo 64. So there it was, the contenders for the great console battle of the mid-90s, the Sony Playstation versus the Nintendo 64. And there was this as well, but it was bollocks. So the PS1 and the N64, both revolutionary consoles in their own right, but was one superior? The answer is yes, and 32 million of you ain't gonna like it. The PlayStation landed in Japanese stores in December of 1994, with worldwide releases following in 1995. With its 32-bit processing system, the graphical capabilities were way beyond anything the home console market had experienced before it. Not to mention Sony's dedicated sound processing chip, which meant that it could play music CDs with audio quality that some claimed to rival $1,000 hi-fi systems of the time. Meanwhile, Nintendo were hard at work delaying their predecessor to the Super Nintendo, tentatively titled Project Reality. It boasted incredibly impressive graphics for the time, and despite Sony being 10 steps ahead when it came to the development of the next generation of consoles, Nintendo were quietly confident that both their console and their reputation would carry them to the inevitable domination of the market. And why wouldn't they think that? Nintendo ruled the roost at the time. Sega had spent years trying to gain the market share with only marginal and fleeting success. Plus, Sony were the company that Nintendo shunned just a year earlier. They'd already made their mind up on Sony. They didn't fear them then, so why would they fear them now? After all, this is the early 90s and we are Nintendo, a name so synonymous with video game consoles that anyone over 40 just thought that's what they were called. Joe, can you clean up your Nintendos? It's a fucking Sega! At this point, Sony doesn't have a loyal following, it doesn't have a lovable cast of characters, there aren't kids going to sleep at night under Sony bedsheets or eating lunch from Sony lunchboxes, and besides, the PlayStation has a measly 32-bit processing chip, and ours has twice as many bits. Bits. What the fuck are bits? Bits was the buzzword in gaming back in the early 90s, a piece of technical specification given to the consumer to indicate the power of the console, despite 90% of consumers having absolutely no idea what a bit actually does. All they know is the NES had 8 bits, the SNES had 16 bits, this piece of shit had 32, and Project Reality was going to have 64 bits. It's not unlike the console war going on now, where this word teraflops is being thrown around like that's some sort of indicator for what a system can actually do. It isn't now, and it wasn't then. Nintendo's reliance on their own reputation and the naivety of the general public that bits means better ultimately was a big mistake. Project Reality, now officially titled Nintendo 64, finally hit shelves in September 1996, nearly 2 years after the PlayStation, and it exploded. It was the most successful launch window of its time, outselling its competitors in the holiday of '96 and going on to sell over 5 million units in its first year globally. Nintendo were back with a boom. Well, it was more of a fart, actually. Whilst potent at first, it dwindled pretty quickly. See, Nintendo's decision to drop Sony and go it alone not only allowed Sony to become their direct competitor, it also left Nintendo without the dedicated technology needed to put video games onto CDs. It was Sony who developed the CDXA format, which enabled visual and audio data to be accessed at the same time from the same CD. Yes, Nintendo could have invested in the technology themselves, or they could have outsourced it, but Nintendo felt their money was best spent elsewhere. This meant that the Nintendo 64 was a cartridge-based system, and whilst cartridge had their benefits, i.e. they couldn't be pirated and load times on cartridges were much quicker than on CDs, the reality was that they were actually very restrictive. Firstly, the cartridges were much more costly to produce. This meant that Nintendo 64 games shelved at a higher price and also failed to drop in price over time. CDs, however, were extremely cheap, meaning that PlayStation games shelved at a cheaper price and then dropped in price substantially over time. Pirating was obviously a big problem at the time for PlayStation, but whilst it affected game sales overall, even pirated games needed the system to run them, meaning that console sales were incredibly consistent year in, year out throughout the PlayStation's time on the market. Secondly, the space available on a Nintendo cartridge was minuscule when compared to the space available on a PlayStation disc. The cartridges had a maximum size of 64 megabytes, while PlayStation discs could hold 700 megabytes per disc. And not only that, they were freely interchangeable in-game as well. This meant that games could be easily packaged with multiple CDs, making size restrictions for developers a thing of the past. Unless you were developing for Nintendo, that is. Unfortunately, that's not where Nintendo's development restrictions ended. Prior to Sony releasing the PlayStation 1, they'd commissioned in-house development team Psygnosis to build a PlayStation 1 development system that would run on standard PCs of the time. The Nintendo 64 development process required a dedicated specialist hardware system, or dev kit, along with the cartridges, which both needed procuring from Nintendo themselves, but only after obtaining an expensive license to develop on said hardware. Even for a third-party company who already had a license and dev kits, they would still have to wait 12 weeks to receive cartridges to begin development on new projects, meaning that developers were unable to respond quickly to market trends and demands. PlayStation developers, however, had the luxury of a much cheaper license and readily accessible development software that could burn games directly to compact disc. It meant that developing for the PS1 was way less restrictive and way more cost effective. It also gave studios the opportunity to create huge games in 3D worlds for the first time. Even Nintendo faithfuls like Squaresoft began moving their future projects over to the PS1. It meant that there was just far more choice on the PlayStation 1, and nothing speaks more to that statement than this.
So my top 5 PS1 games are Cooler World, very hard puzzle game when it gets to it. Crash Team Racing, excellent racing game, better than Mario Kart. And the next 3, don't need explaining, Metal Gear Solid, Tekken 3, and then Final Fantasy VII on top.
Top 5 PS1 games. Number 5, I'll open with Heart of Darkness. Number 4, I'm going to go with Hogs of War. Number 3, I'm going to go with Wild 9. Number 2, I'm going to go with Final Fantasy VII. Number 1, it's going to be Metal Gear Solid.
Top 5 PlayStation 1 games. Number 5 is Pandemonium. Number 4 is Tomb Raider. Number 3 is Tekken 3. Number 2 is Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped, and number 1 has got to be Metal Gear Solid.
Let me show you what man's wallet is. That's what we're talking about. Abe's Oddworld Odyssey, Colin McRae Rally. Number 3, Olympic Soccer, Tony Hawk's. Number 1 is Driver. Trust me.
See, it was possible to have grown up playing the PlayStation 1 and to have had an entirely different experience to the next person. One person's top 5 games could be completely different to the next. On the N64, however, it's always the same answers.
Ocarina of Time. Ocarina of Time.
Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time.
Conker's Bad Fur Day.
Conker's Bad Fur Day.
Smash Bros.
Super Smash Bros.
Majora's Mask.
It's Majora's Mask.
Mario Kart.
Mario 64.
Super Mario 64.
But quality over quantity, right? And this is a fair point. Games like Super Mario 64, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Super Smash Bros, even GoldenEye, they were all revolutionary titles, now fabled and looked back on with immense honour as some of the best releases in gaming history. And it's true, there are titles on the Nintendo 64 that are some of the best games ever made, and that's not the only thing that Nintendo revolutionised with this console. The N64 was the first console to feature rumble in its controllers via an add-on which clipped onto the back of the controller. The console had 4 controller ports, which was a big deal at the time and pushed the emphasis on multiplayer gaming. The controller was the first controller to implement an analog stick for more precise 360-degree movement. The lesson to be learnt here though is that sometimes it doesn't pay to be the innovator, it pays to be the person standing on the shoulders of your achievements and making them better. See, soon after the N64 release, the PlayStation released the DualShock pad. This pad had a built-in rumble system and 2 analog sticks, and it began shipping with console units. Whilst the Nintendo 64 analog stick was a fantastic idea, the position of it was just all wrong. Using the analog stick meant holding the middle grip, which then put the D-pad and the left trigger out of commission. Likewise, if you were using the D-pad, the analog stick and the Z trigger would be out of reach. There were people who found innovative and strange ways to hold the N64 pad to alleviate this issue, but that doesn't make it a good design, it just makes you an inventive player. The DualShock, however, found a way of lining everything up nicely so you could use all that it had to offer at once. The second analog stick meant that you could control the camera angles as well, which reduced but definitely didn't solve the camera issues that were prevalent at the time on both the N64 and the PlayStation 1. Okay, let's talk graphics, and I'm going to bring it back to that point I made earlier about bits and how it was really just a buzzword given to the general public rather than an actual measure of a better system. Any system has to work in tandem with all of its components, and without boring you to sleep, the more bits a processor has, the less RAM it takes up processing data, which means there's more RAM freed up to do other stuff, such as read data from the disc or cartridge, play audio data, increase the frame rate, that sort of thing. This is what allowed the N64 to process a higher polygon count and have smoother graphical processing and more vibrant colours than the PS1. The problem though is that the processor is only capable of processing what exists, and what existed on a Nintendo 64 cartridge wasn't much. That was because of that 64 megabyte data capacity. This meant that whilst the graphics looked smoother, less jagged and generally cleaner, the textures were very flat. The PlayStation discs though, carrying 700 megabytes of data, allowed developers to make much more detailed textures, especially on static objects. This is why games like Resident Evil 2 looked far better on the PS1 than they did on the N64, because all the cartridge space was taken up by just fitting the actual game on it. The sound quality was compressed, the texture quality was reduced, and the lighting suffered, yet the Nintendo 64 was supposed to be the more powerful console. So let's summarise. In 1997, the first full calendar year that Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 1 had been on the market together, only 6 games were published that year by Nintendo. Yes, 6. Sony Interactive Entertainment published 53 games that same year. It was a telling sign that developers were choosing not to develop games for the N64, and whilst Nintendo have and always will be the creators of some of the best games ever made, those games were really all the N64 had. The seeds had already been sown, the poor choices already made, the bridges already burnt, and their reliance on their reputation to carry this console to the top of the pile proved their undoing before the console even hit the shelves. Was the N64 a revolutionary console? Yes. Did it have some of the best games ever made on its roster? Yes. But could the very same question be asked of the PlayStation? Absolutely. And the final sales figures released when these two titans ceased development shows the reality of who won this console war: the Sony Playstation, by a landslide. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like on it. Really helps out with the algorithm. Leave a dislike if I touched a nerve and you're a super N64 fanboy. Listen, I'll be the first to admit, I fucking love the Nintendo 64. I love everything Nintendo. I'm a Nintendo fanboy. I'm just telling you the reality of the situation. If you're new, please subscribe to the channel. Subscribe with notifications on to be entered into this month's giveaway. Because look, I want to buy your games. I'll see you next time.